Good afternoon and welcome, everybody. I am Brandon Rood, Abert Family Curator of American Art at the Milwaukee Art Museum and co-curator of the exhibition Americans in Spain, Painting and Travel, 1820 to 1920. And I want to thank everyone for attending this afternoon's program in conjunction with the exhibition, and especially at this new time, as our speaker is joining us from the UK today. And I want to offer my sincerest thanks to our exhibition sponsors. The exhibition is made possible by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities and by the Henry Luce Foundation. The national presenting sponsor. Our supporting sponsors include the Wyeth Foundation for American Art, the Milwaukee Art Museum's American Art Society, and the Tourist Office of Spain in Chicago. And our contributing sponsors are Christie's and the Gladys Kriebel Delmas Foundation. I want to extend a special thanks to the American Art Society for their support not only of this program, but for all of the exhibition's educational programming. And I also want to remind everyone that these are the final days to see Americans in Spain in Milwaukee, since it closes to the public this Sunday, October 3rd. If you live outside the area or abroad and are unable to make it to see these amazing works of art in person, I encourage you to visit the exhibition page at mam.org, where you can continue to explore the art through the Digital Artist Travelers Project and the exhibition app with extended commentary and bilingual audio. And if even after seeing the exhibition and exploring the digital offerings, you still crave more of Spain, if you find yourself in the Dallas area between now and January 9th, I encourage you to see the exhibition Canvas and Silk, Historic Fashion from Madrid's Museo del Traje, where you'll see several Spanish costumes and garments, perhaps even those related to many of the paintings you'll see in Americans in Spain. And this is a segue to today's topic and speaker, Akemi Luisa Herráez Vossbrink, who just completed a Center for Spain in America curatorial fellowship at the Meadows Museum, and with it organized the exhibition Image and Identity, Mexican Fashion in the Modern Period, also on view at the Meadows until January 9th. And I'm particularly excited about her topic today, Spanish Golden Age Masters in American Collections, a topic relevant to the exhibition, and as we discussed before you all joined us, one relevant to Milwaukee because of the number of Murillo paintings that were exhibited in the 19th century. Through the Americans in Spain exhibition and program and catalog, we've seen how artists like John Singer Sargent experienced Spain, how artists from the United States address Spain's Islamic art, history, and heritage, and learned about travel in Spain yesterday and today with travel expert Rudy Maxa. And if you've missed any of these programs, I encourage you to also visit the museum's YouTube page where you can view them at your leisure. Collecting Spanish Golden Age art was a critical way that many Americans and those across the Americas interacted with Spanish art and with popular images created about Spain, and how many from the United States were introduced to the country's visual culture. And I'm delighted that we have such an expert on the subject joining us today. Akemi has devoted much of her research and dissertation to the topic and is the author of the essay, The Circulation of Paintings by Zurbarán and Murillo in the New World, in the special edition of the Journal for Art Market Studies, The Global Art Market Under the Spanish Empire, 1500 to 1800. In addition to her Meadows Fellowship, Akemi also served as the CEEH Spanish Paintings Curatorial Fellow at London's National Gallery, where she worked on the exhibitions Bartolomé Bermejo, Master of the Spanish Renaissance, and Sorolla, Spanish Master of Light, for which she also contributed to that catalog. As mentioned, Akemi is joining us today from the UK, where she is back at Cambridge University, supervising students in the Art History Department. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome and thumbs up to Akemi Luisa Herráez Vossbrink. Akemi, please.
Thank you very much, Brandon, for the kind introduction and for advertising my exhibition. Greetings, everyone from Cambridge, and thank you for joining. I would like to especially thank Brandon again and China Bounds for offering this opportunity to speak and for giving me an amazing tour of the exhibition and the Spanish highlights from the Milwaukee Art Museum permanent collection earlier this month. The exhibition is housed in a stunning building designed by the Spanish architect Santiago Calatrava. And now I will pass on to the presentation. Before discussing both artists and their works in American collections, I will offer a short biography of Francisco de Zurbarán and Bartolomé Esteban Murillo. These artists spent most of their career in Seville, in southern Spain, where their paths mostly overlapped in the mid-17th century. Both competed for the growing number of commissions from local religious orders, parish churches, and private patrons. Zurbarán's sharp figures against dark backgrounds were preferred during the first half of the 17th century, whereas Murillo's lighter self-compositions became increasingly popular in the second half. They also had a prominent workshops with which they produced paintings for both the local and overseas market. Whereas Zurbarán and Murillo competed at a local level, Zurbarán was recorded as having been much more active on a global scale, exporting over 200 paintings to Latin America from Seville, one of Europe's main ports to the Americas. This talk, though, will focus on Zurbarán and Murillo's reception further north in the United States, covering the period explored by Milwaukee's Americans in Spain exhibition, spanning from the early 19th to the early 20th century. It will highlight the role of American collectors, dealers, artists, and museums in disseminating and popularizing works by both artists. Given the time constraints, I have chosen to focus on Zurbarán and Murillo as I have researched and published on both artists, although Spanish masters such as Velázquez and El Greco also had a substantial impact in the United States during this period. Before starting the presentation, I want to highlight two works by Zurbarán and Murillo, which are currently held in the permanent collection and in the exhibition Americans in Spain. The St. Francis by Zurbarán is one of the most stunning full-length representations of the saint. The Milwaukee Museum of Art acquired Zurbarán's St. Francis in 1955 after moving permanently into the Saarinen Design War Memorial Building. Sorry for the pronunciation. It passed through renowned collections in Spain, where it was owned by the Marquis of Leganés, and France, held at the Salamanca collection, and even Mexico, before it was acquired by the Milwaukee Art Museum. This testifies to the international circulation of these artworks before they reached American collections. Meanwhile, Immaculate Conceptions by Murillo, such as the one shown here from the Prado, were greatly praised, copied, and collected by 19th century American artists and collectors, and also spanning towards the 20th century. Until the early 20th century, there were hardly any Spanish artworks in American collections, except for some works by Murillo. Writer and art critic James Jackson Jarvis even claimed that we need not look for the poetical or imaginative in Spanish art. Even though Murillo's works were acquired in Great Britain since the 18th century, it was not until the late 18th century when the first, now lost work attributed to Murillo of Jacob and Rebecca at the Well arrived in the United States, although now it is argued that this was probably a copy or variant of a painting at the Prado. It was acquired by Boston merchant Thomas Foster, whose main mission was to obtain merino sheep, known for their prized winning wool. According to historian Richard Kagan, he managed to smuggle some of these sheep into the States with the Murillo, which ended up at the Boston Athenaeum, not the sheep, just the Murillo. The next pictures by Murillo to enter the United States were those owned by Richard Worsham Mead, represented in this portrait at the Meadows Museum. He was a Philadelphia merchant who moved to Cádiz, Spain in 1804 and acquired 165 works by Italian and Spanish masters, several of which were attributed to Murillo, possibly including a painting of the Roman Charity. The painting was on display at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia between 1816 and 1845, when it was destroyed by a fire. Luckily, we have this print to the right that may have been based on the now lost Murillo. 29 works attributed to Murillo were then sold at the Mead Collection sale in Philadelphia on March 15, 1853. This interest in Murillo's work was instigated by the 1852 and 1853 sales of Spanish paintings belonging to French General Maréchal Soult and French monarch Louis Philippe, who had confiscated prominent art collections from Spanish religious and civic buildings during the French occupation of Spain between 1808 and 1814. The main 19th century American collector who consistently acquired Spanish paintings was William H. Aspinwall, a New York merchant investing in Panama and the East and West Indies. He acquired the present picture of the Immaculate Conception, currently held at the Detroit Institute of Arts, which he considered a genuine Murillo and a wonderful picture. Meanwhile, the Metropolitan Museum of Art's first painting attributed to Murillo was the Holy Family, which is now housed at the Ringling Museum and unfortunately suffered from a detrimental restoration. It is currently attributed to the workshop of Murillo. Most interestingly, this work was previously held at the convent of Buena Muerte in Lima, Peru, until around 1842. And there is an 18th century copy of it in another Limenian convent. When thinking of Murillo's work, it is normally thought that all of his paintings in American collections were brought from Europe. But there was also a market of Spanish paintings coming from Latin America. Many Spanish paintings were exported to Latin America from the establishment of the viceroyalties in the 16th century, and several Spanish Golden Age artists, most notably Francisco de Zurbarán, exported part of their production overseas. Also, in the 19th century, several Latin American collectors ventured to Europe and acquired Spanish paintings from sales such as that of the previously mentioned Louis Philippe collection in Paris. In 19th century Peru, one of the main wealth sources was the guano commerce, which was used as a fertilizer. Also, as we have seen with the Milwaukee St. Francis, this was acquired from Mexico in the 20th century, proving a prolonged interest in Spanish Golden Age artists in Spanish Golden Age artists in Latin America. I must clarify, from a private Mexican collection it was acquired. That was the previous owner of the painting. Apart from paintings by the workshop or followers of Murillo, there were also copies produced and circulated. There was already a copying tradition in Spain and Latin America before the 19th century. In Lima, for example, and also other parts of Europe, of course. In Lima, for example, there was a Peruvian 18th century artist, Cristobal Lozano, who was recorded as having copied compositions by Murillo for his patrons, for example. Meanwhile, in the United States, already in 1800, New York businessman John R. Murray returned from Europe with possibly copies after Murillo's at the Hermitage. These were especially useful to artists who could not travel to study these works in Europe. One pioneer who wished to tour his collection of European masters was American artist Samuel F.B. Morse, who showcased focus copies from the Louvre of Spanish paintings such as Murillo's Holy Family and the Urchin. You can see the artists copying the paintings at the Louvre, and I highlighted in yellow the 3 paintings by Murillo in this room, including the Holy Family and the Urchin. Similarly, many artists and critics drew from illustrated catalogs, including works by the artists such as William Sterling Maxwell's Annals of the Artists of Spain, and Sir Edmund Heath's A Handbook of the History of Spanish and French Schools of Painting, published in 1848. Whereas most of these painters studied Murillo's artworks in museums and exhibitions in Europe and the United States, some American artists also collected works attributed to Murillo. Such was the case of the American artist Frederick Edwin Church, who was active in the second half of the 19th century and amassed a notable collection of old master paintings at Olana House in the state of New York. Among these, there are several pictures which were ascribed to Murillo, although these are now considered to be copies or paintings by followers. The closest work to the artist is an 18th century copy of Saint Rose of Lima, which is shown here alongside other old master paintings. Despite being a copy, it again demonstrates how significant Murillo's works were to American artists active in the second half of the 19th century, who studied, copied, reinterpreted, and collected works attributed to the artist. The interest in Murillo in Great Britain had been enhanced by 19th century artists such as David Wilkie, John Frederick Lewis, and John Phillips, who copied and reinterpreted his work, and also some of them feature in the Milwaukee exhibition. John Phillips, for example, painted this scene of the young Murillo selling his work in the Calle de Feria in Seville to 2 Dominicans and 1 Franciscan. They are surrounded by a group of Murillo-esque characters, of which some allude to his beggar paintings. There was an 19th century vogue for Murillo in England, but according to Betsy Boone, his association with the Catholic Church was problematic for Americans, struggling to integrate large numbers of Catholic immigrants into a national body. Here we encounter a conflation of stereotypical Golden Age Spain, mixing the picturesque peasants and prelates with the Giralda, the bell tower of Seville's cathedral, which looms in the background. The American artist George Henry Hall varies on this scene in his painting The Thursday Fair of Seville, which style also evokes Murillo's palette. The interest in Hall's Spanish-themed works declined due to the close critical association with Murillo and increasing anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States. Murillo was soon supplanted by Velázquez in the 1870s and 1880s. Okay. In the 1880s. Marie Cassatt also suffered from her associations to Murillo and Hall, but was praised for her technical innovations in this painting by Marie Cassatt titled On the Balcony, and we can see parallels with Murillo's 2 women at the window in the flirtatious, lighthearted characters and the composition, although the male figure is missing from Murillo's painting. Alongside other American artists such as John Singer Sargent, Samuel Coleman, William Merritt Chase, and Thomas Eakins, there was a prolonged representation of Spain as an exoticized country, overlooking its technological and economical advancement. Thomas Sully's painting of the Gypsy Girl was initially designed during his stay in England, and he would have probably had in mind Murillo's urchins or peasant children, maybe perhaps similar to this flower girl on the left, which he could have seen at the Dulwich Picture Gallery. Interestingly, Sully commented after seeing a series of paintings attributed to Murillo that his works looked dirty and cloudy in the flesh, which may have then had an impact on his own portraits. This is visible in The Gypsy Girl, which is painted with brownish earth colors, probably also influenced by the paintings he saw, which were often yellowed with varnish. American artists such as Thomas Sully did not even travel to Spain, but viewed Murillo's paintings in London collections, such as the Dulwich Picture Gallery, which I previously mentioned, which opened in 1817, and at London's National Gallery, inaugurated in 1824. There was also the Manchester Art Treasures exhibition in 1857, which grouped 12,000 paintings, although the Spanish paintings were only about 50. Murillo, though, was especially popular, as his works featured in a vestibule, including 20 paintings attributed to him and 6 to Velázquez. There were also paintings attributed to El Greco, Zurbarán, and other lesser-known Spanish artists. Meanwhile, poor Zurbarán was often overlooked, as visitors such as the American writer Nathaniel Hawthorne just commented on the Murillos. Also, this is due to the smaller number of Zurbaráns that were on view in the UK at the time. As previously mentioned, the most important repository of Spanish works outside Spain in the mid-19th century was the Galerie Espaol, which had been assembled by French monarch Louis Philippe at the Louvre, including works attributed to Murillo, Velázquez, El Greco, and Zurbarán. These were then sold at Christie's auction in 1853, as I mentioned previously, and works such as Francisco de Zurbarán, St. Francis in Meditation, were purchased by London's National Gallery, where it was initially perceived as a distasteful works by art critics. For example, the editor of the Times newspaper deemed it a small, black, repulsive picture. Great admirers of Spanish painting, though, such as the English writer Richard Ford, claimed it a first-class painting, and according to him, no other painting conceived a more true or intense expression of the penitential, prayerful sentiment, again prolonging this sentiment, this vision of Spain as a very Catholic country. The best repository for Spanish art, though, was still undoubtedly Spain, specifically the Prado Museum, which had opened to the public in 1819 and was one of the mandatory stops for American travelers passing through Spain in the 19th century. One of the first visitors, Washington Irving, went to the museum on 5 different occasions, but unfortunately didn't comment on his visits. He did comment, though, on paintings he saw by Murillo at Seville's Hospital de la Caridad, describing them with positive terms such as beautiful, fine, and noble. Later on, with the arrival of more American visitors to the Prado, there was a range of reactions, but Spanish paintings were often associated to the Spanish Black legend and were considered by diplomat John Hay as a range of prim portraits of queens and princes, monks in contemplation, and holy people. Writers such as Henry James propagated this negative vision, claiming that the Spanish schools of all schools were the least valuable. Although he praised some works by Velázquez and Murillo, he described the work by Zurbarán as a shadow of mediocrity. Up to the turn of the 20th century, Murillo's biographer Luisa Alfonso only attributed 8 paintings to the artist in the United States. This fortune changed in the early 20th century when Spanish soul masters were competitively collected in Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York, as well as works by modern Spanish painters such as Mariano Fortuny, Joaquín Sorolla, y Bastida, and Picasso. This was followed by the creation of new institutions devoted to Spanish art, such as the Hispanic Society of America. The founder, Archer Huntington, was especially active acquiring at the turn of the 20th century while he toured Europe with his wife, Helen. In Spain, France, and Germany, he established contacts with dealers. One notable year of acquisitions was 1906, when he was in Paris and acquired from merchant Seldemeyer 5 paintings by Goya, 3 by Zurbarán, 4 by Murillo, and 3 by El Greco, as well as the famous portrait of the Duchess of Alba, painted by Goya, from the gallery E. Gimpel and Wildenstein. These were followed by Huntington and his mother's acquisitions of Velázquez's portrait of a girl and the Count Duke of Olivares from British art dealer Joseph Duveen. He also acquired masterpieces from New York's Erich galleries, such as Saint Emerenciana, which you can see on the left, which was acquired in 1908 and presented to the Hispanic Society in 1925. Meanwhile, the 3 works attributed to Murillo acquired by Huntington, well, actually the 4 works acquired to Murillo acquired by Huntington, are now ascribed to the school of Murillo. It was not until 1997, with the purchase of Murillo's prodigal son amongst the swine, that the Hispanic Society incorporated a painting fully ascribed to the master. Then we have the New York collector Henry Clay Frick, who during his visit to Spain in 1904 acquired a self-portrait by Murillo akin to the one at the National Gallery. This painting was so cherished by Frick and his descendants that it remained part of the family's collection until recently when it was donated to the museum. It also was a rare find, as there was a greater interest in his religious and picaresque beggar scenes. In the first half of the 20th century, Murillo lost favor to artists such as Velázquez and El Greco. His paintings were described as sentimental ecstasy, amiable, tearful, and bland. In a book on the Prado Museum by C.S. Ricketts in 1907, it was not until the second half of the 20th century, with the guidance of scholarly curators, that Murillo regained his popularity, resulting in the acquisition by American museums of several paintings and drawings by the artist during the last decades. Even though I mentioned Zurbarán briefly, now I'm going to focus more on him. Zurbarán was mostly overlooked in the United States until the turn of the 20th century, when the monograph by Cascales y Muñoz was translated into English. Zurbarán, though, did feature in early American exhibitions, such as the 1874 exhibition at the Boston Athenaeum, where 4 scenes representing Christ's childhood, of which I show Christ and the Virgin Mary, of which I show one example here, now held at the Grenoble Museum, featured alongside other works owned by the Duke of Montpensier. In the early 20th century, paintings by Zurbarán featured in Isabella Stewart Gardner's collection, which is housed in Boston. She was greatly interested in Spanish art, and when she visited the Prado, she documented her visit with photos of pictures by Velázquez, Murillo, Rivera, and Zurbarán, of which she then created scrapbooks. She also spent some time in Seville and greatly admired the city. This interest was mostly indebted to her friendship with American artist John Singer Sargent. There in Spain, she acquired her first painting by a Spanish artist, a Virgin of Mercy, then attributed to Zurbarán, now considered to be by his studio, and housed in her private parlor in her Boston home. It was later moved to her Spanish chapel, which was dedicated to her deceased son, as apparently the Christ child reminded the Gardners of him. Here we see a photo of the chapel with its eclectic mix of silverware, a crucifixion, capitals, and a sculpture of a bishop praying. This was followed by another work attributed to Zurbarán, acquired in 1906, The Doctor of Laws at Salamanca. She acquired it from New York's Erich Galleries and wrote to Spanish art expert Bernard Berenson, claiming that she bought it just of pure love. I do like the young Salamanca students, she claimed. She also said that Huntington had been keen to buy it for his Spanish collection and was cursing himself for his delay, for he saw it months ago. Some years later, the American Railroad executive based in Montreal, William C. Van Horn, purchased one of the most spectacular female statues by Zurbarán, Saint Casilda, which is currently held at the Thyssen Museum in Madrid. He displayed it alongside other Spanish pictures in the central corridor of his Montreal mansion. Unfortunately, apart from the Zurbarán and a painting by El Greco, most of Van Horn's Spanish paintings were copies or fakes. Like Isabella Stewart Gardner, he was encouraged to collect Spanish art by an American artist, his friend William Merritt Chase. Chase may have referred to paintings by Zurbarán as models for his still lifes, as can be seen in an example in the exhibition at the Milwaukee Art Museum. Another collector from Chicago, Charles Deering, acquired a medieval hospital in the coastal town at Sitges, where he housed a prominent Spanish art collection, including Zurbarán's Saint Romanus, acquired from the Madrileñan antiquarian Apolinar Sanchez, and currently held at the Art Institute of Chicago. Several Murillos, as well as paintings by other contemporaries and medieval artists. Major acquisitions of works by Zurbarán happened more in the second half of the 20th century, with the Art Institute of Chicago acquiring in 1954 it's the Crucifixion by Zurbarán, originally painted for the Dominican order at San Pablo el Real in Seville, Saint Serapion, which was acquired in 1951 by Wordsworth's Athenaeum after passing through several English collections in the 19th century, and Still Life with Lemons, Oranges and a Roast, purchased in 1972 by California industrialist Norton Simon, and currently held at his museum in Pasadena, California. Meanwhile, the Meadows Museum, where I was working at until this Monday, owns one Zurbarán and 5 Murillos of different formats and subjects. One of the most striking Murillos is Jacob and his flock, which corresponds to a series of paintings depicting the life of Jacob, which are scattered between the Cleveland Museum of Art and the Hermitage, apart from the Meadows example, of course. This series was initially painted for the Marquis of Villamanrique, and it was bought by the Meadows Museum director Bill Jordan, alongside Murillo's Small Crucifixion on copper and Zurbarán's Mystic Marriage of St. Catherine at New York's Waldenstein and Cole Gallery in 1967. The latter painting by Zurbarán was previously held in the William Stirling Maxwell collection in Scotland, which belonged to the Spanish art specialist William Stirling, who collected and wrote about Spanish paintings in the mid-19th century. Oh, sorry, not yet. Other important collections with works by Murillo and Zurbarán in the United States, not mentioned in this lecture, include the Kimball Art Museum, the Toledo Museum of Art, the Cincinnati Art Museum, the J. Paul Getty Museum, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the San Diego Art Museum, the Timken Museum, El Paso Museum of Art, Houston Museum of Fine Arts, the Minneapolis Art Museum, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the Worcester Art Museum, the Museo de Arte de Ponce in Puerto Rico, the Low Art Museum in Miami, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Mildred Lane Kemper Museum in St. Louis, and the Cleveland Museum, amongst others. And many of these pieces were acquired more in the later half of the 20th century. And if I had more time, I would expand on them. But since we're limited, I wanted to show especially highlights, as I indicated, at the beginning that's the span from the 19th century to mostly the early 20th century, but I wanted to highlight the Meadows Museum as I was working with the collection recently. So, in conclusion, this presentation has offered an overview of how paintings by Murillo and Zurbarán were collected and perceived in the United States throughout the 19th and part of the 20th century. Murillo had a great impact throughout the 19th century and the second half of the 20th century, whereas Zurbarán was mostly collected in the United States from the early 20th century. Since Murillo's paintings reached the United States at an earlier date, these also had a stronger impact on American artists who collected, copied, and reinterpreted his works throughout the 19th century. Meanwhile, Zurbarán had less of an impact on American artists who in the 20th century were focusing more on artists such as Velázquez and later El Greco, praised for their modern painting techniques. And if you're interested to expand on this, for example, at the Prado not too long ago, there was an exhibition on El Greco and modern masters. Nevertheless, American museums continue collecting works by Murillo and Zurbarán, perpetuating their significance as two of the most revered Spanish Golden Age masters. Thank you very much. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will be more than happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Akemi. That was fantastic. And I love that you gave a really broad overview of how collectors and artists from the United States were attracted to or how they considered this art, and especially the variety of collections that they ended up in or who earnestly collected these paintings. I will invite everyone, as Akemi did, to please join the conversation with any questions that you might have. To start, there were a couple that came in at the beginning. And so just a matter of housekeeping, one was about the reference to Murillo in Milwaukee. And that was to a conversation that China, Akemi, and I were having in advance of the presentation, that Milwaukee, like many industrializing cities in the United States in the latter half of the 19th century, held a series of expositions that were meant to highlight agriculture, industry, but also the fine and decorative arts. And at those expositions, there were many Murillos shown. And I think it points to what Akemi was saying about the taste for Murillo in the United States. At the time, these were collected and shown in Milwaukee at the end of the 19th century, kind of suggesting still the popularity he had at that particular time. And also then one other question was about the catalog. And yes, there is a catalog to the exhibition, and you can find copies available. Kemi, oh, that's so great. Thank you so much. You can find copies available through the Milwaukee Art Museum store if you go to mam.org. And with that, I will start looking at some of the questions. But I'm going to start with one of my own, and that is, I loved how you brought in some of these comments about the paintings from critics, artists, writers, not all of them complimentary or even fair. Small, black, repulsive picture, for example, a shadow of mediocrity. And we've also had discussion in the exhibition, in the catalog, about the changing and transitioning tastes for Spanish art in the long 19th century into the early years of the 20th. And so you've talked about some in terms of citing the Betsy Boone and her research in terms of the taste for Catholic art. You mentioned at the beginning that you are concentrating on Murillo and Zurbarán in particular, but I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on those shifting tastes from something that was light and airy and colorful, emotionally expressive like Murillo, to those dark, repulsive, if you will, paintings by Zurbarán and other masters.
Yes, no, thank you so much for your question. I think there was this interest already, which was promoted in the UK. I didn't mention in detail, but Reynolds and other British contemporaries were very much disseminating the figure of Murillo, copying, repainting, as was the case of one painting at the Wallace collection. So there was all this happening already in the UK, and this transferred to the United States. And there was this avid interest more in the secular scenes, but the Immaculate Conceptions as well were highly revered. And if anything, they were kind of combined, as we saw in that painting with John Phillips, where they bring everything together. No, it was like an amalgamation of what Murillo represents here, no, and this kind of exoticized view as well, or like imaginary view of Spain around that period. But it was Spain also that was that they viewed in this very kind of light and airy way with the Murillo, through Murillo, but they didn't want to see that other Spain, the darker Spain. And what is interesting is even in Spain, after a pivotal point in 1898, with the loss of the last Spanish colonies in Cuba and the Philippines, there was this also interest and shift into these darker paintings. No, and you can see it with artists like Zuloaga, who really promoted this dark palette, and also many artists from the many writers from the period of the Generación del 98, the generation of the 98, shifted towards this darker Spain. And what is interesting is that then this was also incorporated more broadly in reaching the United States. And then also it was in terms of the technique, no? When I briefly mentioned El Greco, his elongated, very sometimes ghostly abstract brushstrokes were very much in vogue with artists such as even Jackson Pollock, because it was also a transition in terms of the technique. Zurbarán had more of this brief period in the early 20th century, but it was really Velázquez and ultimately El Greco who became the signifiers of modernity in the 20th century. Not only in the United States, there's also artists like Mata in Latin America that brought El Greco onto a podium. So it was really a global phenomenon, which I want to emphasize. And perhaps Zurbarán didn't reach that much of a global phenomenon, but he was reinterpreted, I must say, by famous artists like Dalí, who did a painting of this skull that converges, that looks like it's a series of monks and then an opening that resembles a skull. So he was reinterpreted by his Spanish modern artists as well. But not as much, I would say, as Velázquez and El Greco.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
To continue, you, in addition to me in China, you have some fans out there. Susan just wanted to say thank you for an excellent presentation. She liked the railway magnates and industrialists collecting details. And then another a compliment from, I believe, Susan about another excellent presentation and thanking you. And then some other questions, and I'll start with Elisa's. And I'm also going to add to that a little bit, so apologies in advance for doubling up, and hope that it won't be too much of a shock. But Elisa's question is, did any of these Spanish masters study with other famous European painters? And to that, because it was hitting me as you were giving your presentation, the number of artists who were involved in connecting the collectors to the collections or to the painters and the paintings. So the double question, did any of these Spanish masters study with other European painters? And then the other one from me, what do you think the role was in these artists like Sargent or Cassatt in directing the collectors or guiding the collections?
Yes, no, thank you. I imagine that the question about the Spanish artists, the first one is more about the Spanish Golden Age artists in particular. So what is interesting is that there is the myth that Murillo perhaps went to the Americas because there's a record that he was going to go on a ship and go abroad, but he stayed in Spain, and so did Zurbarán. But we must remember that Seville in their period was a very cosmopolitan city. There was a great community of Flemish artists that were active at the time, and there was a lot of Italian art coming in. So there were all these influxes coming and converging there. And of course, there were products and paintings coming from the Americas. So even though they did not, let's say, have a mentor that was of another nationality, they were very much exposed and working with artists of Flemish backgrounds, Italian, etc. And they saw works by them as well that were important to Spain. Including several in Seville's cathedral, etc. And also the influx of prints. We must not forget that this was very influential in their career. Flemish and German prints especially dictated a lot of these compositions. And that's why sometimes we see that some of the compositions is a bit antiquated, as in representing scenes or clothing that were popular a century ago, because they're following closely these prints that were produced a century ago. So there's this kind of mixture happening. And then for the question of Cassatt, Chase, etc., as I have discussed previously with Isabella Stewart Gardner, Huntington, many of these looked at these artists and revered them. Like Huntington knew these artists, Sargent and his contemporaries, and they were pivotal in not only promoting Golden Age artists, but also promoting artists that were contemporary at the time, such as Sorolla and Zuluaga, and that's what really skyrocketed them. And also Sorolla and Zuluaga exhibited their works in these exhibitions we've been discussing in the United States. And that's where many of these artists, such as Sargent, Chase, etc., would have seen them. And what is interesting is that artists such as Sorolla reinterpreted scenes by Velázquez, and then these were shown in these exhibitions. So sometimes American artists saw these works by Velázquez reinterpreted by Sorolla. So they might have been unawarely copying, let's say, works by Velázquez filtered through Sorolla. So it's interesting how you get these, and the same with the American artists like Sargent, Chase, etc., that went to copy at the Prado, no? So there is this intermediary filter. But as I also explained, there were some artists like Sully who never went to Spain. So there's also that aspect coming in. Thank you for the question.
No, that was great, because it kind of leads me to another question. As it's presented in the exhibition, as you saw, there's kind of a trajectory of some of these copies, even paintings that were attributed to some of these artists, whether Zurbarán or Velázquez, because they were such hot commodities at that particular moment, then going to someone like Sorolla, who was doing his own interpretation, then someone like Robert Henry, who of course was then copying directly. So you see these various different lenses and filters as you walk through the exhibition. And then that leads me to another question of my own, and that is in terms of collecting, especially the artists you focused on. was the interest so intense, the rage, if you will, for all of these artists, the fashion, to the extent that they were just acquiring anything, or was there a bit more discernment, or even, should we say, subterfuge involved in any of this? So, for example, the American copyists kept their copies typically in their studios as models, as inspiration. But for collectors, was there a difference in acquiring these? They were just so anxious to get their hands on them.
Yes, that's a very good question. I think there was less of a filter of, well, also there was less of a knowledge of the catalog of works by these artists, because as I mentioned, for example, Zurbarán's works were really known to the English-speaking public through, let's say, Sterling Maxwell, and then Cascales y Muñoz with his translation of his catalog on Zurbarán. But even so, there were very few of these publications circulating. And if you don't go to Spain to see the masterworks, it is difficult to discern the copies from the reals. And even in the Galerie Louis Philippe, the Spanish gallery, there were tons of paintings attributed to Zurbarán Murillo, let's say, but who knows how many were genuinely by them. So, of course, they would go to these exhibitions and see these, and there was such a vogue and a push for them that sometimes, of course, they would have sold them as another artist or wouldn't have simply known. And also, of course, the prices go up if you say that it's by Zurbarán or Murillo. And what is interesting, though, is in the 19th century, there were mainly the paintings I indicated in the presentation were by Fowler's workshop, circle of copies. And as I said, some American collectors would then commission copies done or paint copies and bring them over from Europe. And this wasn't only the case in the States. There were fairs, for example, in Latin America, where they also had all these copies, or even in Europe. And they would keep on circulating. So sometimes it took quite a while until there was this discernment between genuine and kind of studio off, workshop off. And I think sometimes we are very particular nowadays, but artists weren't concerned very often by these distinctions. So I think it's important to kind of outline these distinctions there.
That's great. Thank you. And
Thank you.
Really good question here, kind of building on that. And that was, again, is the exhibition, the catalog have talked about, and certainly during your presentation, the availability of many of these works in European institutions, whether the National Gallery in London, the Dulwich, as you mentioned, in regards to Soli, the Prado, of course. And one of the questions is, what availability were there of Spanish collections in the United States? As you kind of showed through your presentation, we saw Mary Cassatt, and clearly you see the influence from Goya or from Murillo, as you discussed. And as the exhibition shows and talks about the vogue for copying Spanish painting in the end of the 19th and early 20th century. But were there collections in the United States, Frick, Isabella, Stewart, Gardner, these sorts of things that artists from the United States were attracted to?
Yes, no. For example, the Huntington, the Hispanic Society was one of the meccas. And as I mentioned, Huntington obviously was familiar with Sargent's, Chase's works. And they would come to see these works by the contemporary artists, or exhibitions that were done by the Spanish artists or the Golden Age masters. So definitely. And then again, there were these, it was really these American artists such as Chase and Sargent, that prompted people like Isabella, Stewart, Gardner to acquire these works. So they were very much behind the acquisitions even before seeing the works in many cases. So they were involved throughout the process, these artists, because they were the connoisseurs. They were kind of like the art critics of the time in that sense. And they established the parameters of what artists to collect very often.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I think then also pursuant to that, Shirley was asking if there was a museum in Spain that seemed to be mainly Murillo. She thought it was Toledo. But of course, you discussed Sevilla as a major kind of transportation center and access point. And of course, many of the artists from the United States study there. But if you could also point to some additional collections of Murillo in Spain.
Yes, the Prado Museum is the Prado Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts in Seville. Definitely, that's a place to go. The Academy of San Fernando in Madrid is also really good. The Thyssen Museum in Madrid is also exceptional. You also get some works at the Valencia Fine Arts Museum in Bilbao, the Museum of Fine Arts. They're really truly scattered all over, but I would say the main collections are the Prado Museum and the Museum of Fine Arts in Seville. Thank you for your question.
Excellent. And then there is one, perhaps best answered by me, from Kevin about the acquisition of the Zurbarán. And you've talked about collecting and the kind of changing and altering tastes. But his question was specifically about the international attention to ma'am, that the purchase, the acquisition of this painting received. And why would a painting by him have been viewed as so significant for a US museum? And I can start that for the Milwaukee Art Museum. Part of it was that this was in the mid-20th century, so at a pivotal moment of the museum's collecting and establishment. And it was the first Spanish master painting to enter the museum's collection and then have a wide audience. And you've also, Akemi, talked about even as late as the 1950s, some of these paintings coming to American collections and that continued interest. Do you see, or have you thought about any part of that? Meaning that, of course, the exhibition really talks about more second half of the 19th century, early 20th century. You've discussed these changing tastes, of course, kind of moving to someone like Zurbarán or El Greco as modernism was coming to the fore, and how they inspired a different group of artists and collectors. Even the references to Zuloaga and to Dalí and all of these things. But these continued tastes into the 20th century, the mid-20th century, if you had encountered that in your research or had any thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's very interesting because sometimes I wonder, because Zurbarán exported works to the Americas, whether they finally found their way in the 20th century, because they are acquiring. There are many countries such as Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, that are now acquiring works by these masters. Because what is interesting is because there are Catholic countries, so there's a push for these religious images almost more than in other countries, no? And I see it really happening in these countries, and it's fascinating because many of them come from Europe or even from the United States, and they end up in these collections. And for me, actually, these are becoming some of the strongest collections of Spanish Golden Age masters, because but also the United States, we must not forget that there's also an interest in continuing this collecting trend because there's a prominent Hispanic community. So there is a big Catholic group in the United States. And this also prompts this interest because many of the Spanish Golden Age masters, really the paintings that are mostly on sale are religious paintings. So there is definitely a push, and also combining the Spanish Golden Age masters with colonial Latin American art is one of the recent trends that's really happening in the United States, having the more global empire kind of context to these works, which is also a new dialogue that's happening in many American museums.
That's great. Thank you so much. And
thank you.
Everybody for joining us today and contributing to the conversation. And I want to especially thank Akemi for her wonderful presentation. I can't thank you enough. That was really incredible. So again, everyone, please join me in giving the virtual thumbs up and applause. And thanks to Akemi.
Thank you, everyone. Take care, and greetings from Cambridge. Thank you, Brandon. You've been great.
Oh, no, you've been great. Thank you so much, everybody. And
thank you. Adios.